Well, there's been a church here since the 7th century, but the building that we are in at the moment was substantially rebuilt in the 12th and 13th centuries and partially added to with a brick tower in the 17th century. The Reformation in this country took place in the 16th and 17th centuries as a result of the Church of England's break from Rome. And at that time, we became what would now be described as very puritanical. Churches were whitewashed, any stained glass was destroyed, statues were removed. Churches became very plain and simple, and plain glass windows were installed at that time. And they remained here until the 20th century. The churches brightened up a bit in the 19th century, and a lot of the tidying up then and smartening up of this church occurred with the Victorians in the 19th century. But it wasn't until the 20th century that things dramatically changed here. The daughter of the local landowner died in a tragic accident, and as a result of that, her parents commissioned Marc Chagall to make a memorial window for her. And when he came here for the dedication of that window, he didn't come before the window was dedicated. He came in the south door and saw facing him a row of plain glass windows. And he said, "This is magnificent. I will do them all." Marc Chagall was a Russian Jew, and from the time he was 22 years old, he lived most of his life in France, because the revolution in Russia came in 1917, and he ultimately became persona non grata because his image of art was not that of the revolutionaries. So he went to live in France and continued painting and creating many, many beautiful things. From the time he was about 40, he had always wanted to fill a place of worship with his work. He didn't mind if it was a synagogue, a church, or a temple, because he believed very strongly that we are all children of Abraham. It's not God who separates us, but man. And he had a message of God's love that he wanted to transmit to as many people as possible. When he started painting in glass, he was already over 70, and he continued painting glass until he was 97, in fact 3 months short of his 98th birthday. And the first commission he ever had was in fact for a mosaic in a little church in the High Savoy region of France. And when he was making this mosaic, he saw a plain glass window behind the baptism area, and he thought he would try painting a window. It's very monochrome compared with what you see around you. It had a little bit of blue and a little bit of yellow, but not much else. But it was very definitely Chagall. And then subsequent to that, his first big commission was for the Hadassah synagogue windows in Jerusalem. And he didn't really want to do them because he wanted his message of God's love to reach as many people as possible. The rabbi at the Hadassah synagogue eventually persuaded him that he could have a 12-month period with the windows to do whatever he wished with before they were installed in Jerusalem. And for 6 months they were on show in Paris, and for 6 months at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Sarah Davigor Goldsmith and her mother, Lady Rosemary, went to Paris to see the Hadassah synagogue windows. Sarah was 18. Her mother was already a collector of 20th century art, and in fact Sarah bought the very first David Hockney ever sold at the Royal College of Art's graduate exhibition, and she paid £12 for it. It now belongs to her sister Chloe's daughter. And at the Hadassah synagogue window exhibition, she was enthralled, absolutely enthralled by it. When she came home, her sister tells me she could talk of nothing else. Sarah tragically died in a sailing accident 2.5 years later. And her mother was absolutely certain that there was only one form of memorial she wanted, and that was a Chagall window. Well, Sarah drowned in 1963, in September 63, and her mother approached Chagall at the end of that year, beginning of 64. I don't know the specific date. And there was a lot of discussion and negotiation. Chagall was already making many windows in Europe at that time. So he was a busy chap. And Lady Rosemary was able to persuade him without too much difficulty to create a memorial window for Sarah. The windows that we had at the east end of the church were neo-Gothic. I was speaking earlier about the Victorians coming here and tidying everything up, and in fact they did create 4 Victorian stained glass windows. So an architect was engaged to create a Romanesque style window, because Chagall much preferred the broader canvas. When he came here for the dedication of the window, he was delighted to see plain glass post-Reformation windows as he came into the church, and literally at the moment he came in, he said, "I will do them all." Chagall was determined to fill the church. He had wanted to do so for many decades, to fill a place of worship with his work. And the people of the village, this was very much an agricultural community still in the 1960s, were not that keen on a 20th century artist putting glass into their windows and perhaps rather idiosyncratic pictures. The majority of the village were very happy that this should happen. But such was the dissent that when it came to the last 4 windows that were installed, which are the ones in the chancel, the village was divided. And eventually they were just stored away, wrapped in sacking, probably in Chloe's barn. In 1985, there was an exhibition of Chagall's work at the Royal Academy. Normally you can't show glass windows in a gallery, but on this occasion, because they hadn't been installed, they went into the exhibition, the last 4 windows. Sir Hugh Casson, who was president of the RA at that time, had arranged for light boxes to be made so that light shone through the glass. And that, with Lady Rosemary's cooperation, she was a friend of Hugh Casson, enabled us to have the Victorian windows still in the church, but in the vestry, at the west end of the church, and for the installation of Chagall's last 4 windows. And he knew before he died that his wish to fill a church with his work was to be fulfilled. Chagall said that the Bible was the greatest source of poetry of all time, and the images from the Bible stories are those that he wants to share. And he was very well versed in what Christians call the Old Testament, particularly the book of Psalms. He heard a psalm read in his home every day of his young life and loved them and knew them by heart. But when he came to working in churches, and in fact the Hadassah synagogue in Israel is the only Jewish synagogue that he ever worked in. All his glass work is in churches and cathedrals, with the exception of a couple of glass windows in the Knesset in Israel and the Peace Window in the United Nations building in New York. But when he painted in churches, he wanted to tell a story. And in this church, the story starts with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and he chose Psalm 8 as his theme for the other windows, or certainly for the blue windows. The golden windows are something slightly different. Well, this is the window that brought Chagall to Tudeley. It's a memorial window to Sarah Davigor Goldsmith. And when you look at the window, you see at the bottom third a very large area of blue. Sarah is lying in the water, and on the left-hand side of that water is her mother, Lady Rosemary Davigor Goldsmith, with her 2 daughters at her breast. Sarah, already a ghostly figure, Chloe, the younger daughter, who is still alive and well, a strong, vibrant child. In the middle of the window, there is a red horse, and Chagall, in his conversations with Lady Rosemary, Sarah's mother, had learnt how much Sarah enjoyed horse riding. For Chagall, horses and donkeys were for happiness, and the colour red for joy. So he imagined Sarah riding her horse in the gardens of paradise, and has portrayed her in that way. On the right-hand side of the window, there is a ladder. Chagall painted canvases and many windows with crucifixes in. And whenever he did, he invariably painted a ladder too, going back to the Old Testament, which as a Jew he was very, very familiar with. And it's Jacob's ladder, firmly planted in the earth, rising up to heaven, as Jacob saw in his dream. And at the top of the ladder, there is Christ on a cross. This is not a Christ in agony. There is no crown of thorns, no holes in his hands or feet, but his arms are outstretched. But Chagall saw those arms as those of a benevolent young man, welcoming these 2 young people to himself. No scars, no agony, no pain, a benevolent young man associating himself with them. This is my favourite window, largely because it endorses Chagall's philosophy, in my opinion, of the brotherhood of man, the sharing of the 3 great monotheistic faiths. And the reason I say this is because the head of the angel in this window, many of us believe to be a self-portrait of Chagall, who had in the past painted scores of self-portraits with his first wife, Bella, who died in New York in 1944. Here, the angel has Chagall's head, and under the wing of this angel is written Vava, V-A-V-A. This was his nickname for his wife, Valentina. Also in the window, you will see the hand of God at the top of the window, and with only 4 fingers, because as a Jew, he was limited in depicting the human form in a perfect way. And there's also a goat and a few other symbols in there, but the important aspect is this angel sheltering his Jewish wife in a Christian church. Well, this window starts the whole story of the creation with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, passing the fruit between them, the tree of knowledge behind them, and it's very obviously Adam and Eve. It's one of the few windows in the church where the message is pretty clear. What isn't quite so clear unless you look really closely is that the angel of the Lord is rushing down out of the right-hand window, pointing an accusatory finger at Adam and Eve and saying, "Get out of this place. You have broken the law. You have let down the message that you were given by God, and you're not welcome here anymore. Out you go." And if you look closely at the angel of the Lord, you will see how brilliantly Chagall made this movement in glass. I can't imagine how he did it, but it really looks as if the angel of the Lord is rushing, and pretty angry too. This window is one of 2 gold windows. Gold Chagall saw as a colour of mysticism, and the colour for him promises new life, unlike the blues which predominate in this church, which talk about God's love, blue being Chagall's image for the colour of love. And when he made his first maquette for these two golden windows, his first designs, where you now see a butterfly in the top right-hand corner of the right lancet, was a bouquet of flowers. Chagall painted many bouquets of flowers, and he hadn't thought about the butterfly image at all. But when it came to the work in the studio and painting on the images to the coloured glass, he remembered a pagan story that his mother had told him. Pre-Christian, pre-Judaism, very old. And this is that the butterfly is a symbol of rebirth, of new life. And these are the heavenly windows. There are candles at the top lighting the way to heaven, and this lovely, glorious, golden, revelationary light. So instead of the bouquet, he painted a butterfly. And then he changed the image of the angel in the middle of the window, and the angel has windows symbolic of a butterfly. And in the lower left-hand corner, there is a bird who's been given butterfly wings. The purple butterfly in the right lancet is very clear. And only comparatively recently did I realise that in the left-hand, far left lancet, there is another purple butterfly, and this one is standing up with its wings drooping, sipping nectar from a flower. There are at least half a dozen other wing images that could create more butterflies in this window. And as a little anecdote, I'd like to tell you that this story was told me by a rabbi of the Jewish Reform Synagogue, who came here with the National Council of Christians and Jews. And she told me about the symbolism of the butterfly. And subsequently, I have seen butterflies in so many paintings of death, particularly primitive African paintings, scores of dead bodies on the ground, but clouds of beautiful butterflies in the sky above. So Chagall has brought another philosophy into this church for us. In the lower right-hand corner is the one occasion in the 12 windows where both Chagall and Charles Mark, who was the atelier and the studio, the maker of the windows, have both signed their names. Not only that, we've got a date, 1974, and we've also got Reims, which is where the studio was, that all our windows were made.